Head of Global Justice now, Chair of the UK Trade Justice Movement, Co-Chair of the Global Campaign for Climate Action. He was also coordinator of New Zealand's campaign against the TPP, and until recently, a Green Party member of Parliament in New Zealand. Take it away, Barry.
In the words of Indigenous New Zealand, kia ora koutou. Welcome to everyone coming to this fantastic forum. I'm really grateful for the invitation to come here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is not always considered to be either an Asian or a European country. So thank you very much for including me. Thank you also for the two presentations from Renee and David to start us off. My role is to talk about the context globally for public services. And the issues that I wanted to talk about is the way that the global institutions and the global negotiations are pushing for privatization of public services, the private financing of public services, and essentially the loss of accountability in public services. So I wanted to deal with two particular areas. The first is the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Development Bank, all the other regional development banks, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Europe. These financial institutions are pushing very hard for public-private partnerships. And the second area I wanted to talk about is the specifics of some trade agreements. And I wanted to spend most time on the trade agreements because there are some very real threats at the moment from trade agreements, and we need to make the links between the global and the local. And part of the message that I'm trying to say is that we need to fight our campaigns on different levels. We can't only sit there and fight our campaigns on a local level because we will be swamped by the pressures from the global institutions and the global trade agreements. So we need to connect up our struggles. Let me start off with the international financial institutions. As Renee said, he traced the history of what happened under structural adjustment programs, and civil society fought structural adjustment programs. I was part of those struggles. Many of you were part of those struggles. We fought from the 1980s through to year 2000 and beyond, and we fought their pretense of reform on structural adjustment. Remember adjustment with a human face and the kind of softer adjustment, the kind of policy dialogues and everything else. They tried to co-opt the civil society into making their structural adjustment programs more acceptable. And I think this was a fantastic civil society campaign that we did a huge amount, linked up globally, to delegitimize the structural adjustment programs. And eventually we had, quite recently, the IMF head Christine Lagarde say, we don't do that anymore with regard to structural adjustment. So we need to celebrate our successes. But did we win? Well, only partially, because as Renee said, what they did then was that they just transferred the paradigm. They transferred the paradigm away from all of the measures on Washington Consensus and structural adjustment, and they transferred it into private finance, privatization, and public-private partnerships. So essentially what you've seen is a continuation of the same paradigm, but through a different lens and through different instruments. And so at the moment we face an even greater threat, because the World Bank has just agreed a new strategy for their work. And in that, they say that we will do everything to make sure that we push commercial funding of infrastructure and public services. We will remove the impediments through conditionalities in our lending. We will take the risk away from the private sector and give it back to the public sector, and we will only provide finance for public services as a last resort. This is written in their strategy. We're also faced with the takeover by the World Bank and other institutions of important processes that we all feel strongly about. The Sustainable Development Goals. At the Addis Ababa Conference on Financing the SDGs, public-private partnerships are right at the core of funding SDGs. So the efforts by global capital and the World Bank is to subvert the SDGs into another excuse for funding infrastructure and public services. How do they do this? And there's a wonderful example of a hospital in Lesotho. This hospital was a replacement for an old hospital. And the negotiations went on, and they were facilitated by the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank. And eventually, the costs of that single hospital, which is primarily serving the more middle class consumers in the urban areas, the cost took up half of Lesotho's health budget annually. And they did this through add-ons of costs, and I'm sure David's going to talk more about this, and they did it through, once they had the monopoly, escalations in the price. They linked the inflation to South Africa's medical costs inflation. They basically made the company a 25% return on equity, and they laid all the risk back onto the government. So the loans for the private sector deal were actually government guaranteed loans. So the picture of public-private partnerships is increasingly that the private sector gets the sweetheart deal, they put up very little equity, and they get the risk coverage assumed by the public sector. And in Lesotho, 3/4 of the population live in rural areas, and they're the ones who need primary health care most urgently. But half of the budget is taken up by a single hospital. And that single hospital was estimated to be between 3 and 4.5 times as costly as the hospital that it replaced in terms of an annual cost. So this is the way that we see the private sector cherry-picking the profitable sectors and leaving the public sector with no money in order to serve most of the population, including those who most need the services. And again, you see the role of the World Bank and the IFC and other institutions as not only promoting public-private partnerships, but setting themselves up to evaluate them, setting themselves up to finance them, and often, as in Lesotho case, they get a success fee out of arranging the deal. So this push from the international financial institutions on privatization is going into a dangerous area. One of the dangerous areas then links to the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is trade policy. Now, if countries want to take back PPPs, take back privatization, then very often they face lawsuits from doing so. And these lawsuits come under often the provisions of trade agreements. And many of you have heard of the Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, provisions in trade agreements. And what the ISDS does, it sets up a mechanism whereby the regulations and the change in laws by government to reprivatize or to regulate the private sector monopolies are grounds for the companies who are affected, whose profits are affected, to take cases in an international tribunal against the government. Now, there have been over 830 of these cases documented by UNCTAD. These cases have been across so many different sectors. They have been in healthcare, in education, in water, in virtually all public services, and a lot of them have been in extractive industries and mining in particular. The payouts to these companies have run into the many billion dollars. And the difficulty is that these are secret arbitrations, so we never get to see the full details of these arbitrations. When we do, we see how biased the arbitration system is towards the companies. And there are conflicts of interest because one day somebody will act as a plaintiff, act as a prosecutor on behalf of the company, and the next day they'll be the adjudicator of the panel. And so there is no judicial process, there is no just law process. What you have is a process that is skewed towards the interests of the multinationals. So these ISDS provisions are not necessarily guaranteed within every contract for PPPs, but they are negotiated as part of trade agreements. Now, these trade agreements come in different forms, and I want to step back a bit because one of the key agreements that affects services is called the General Agreement on Trade and Services. It's a WTO agreement. It was agreed in 1995 when the WTO was set up, and it was agreed after a huge push from the multinationals. In fact, the head of the services division at that time said, if it wasn't for American Express and Citicorp pushing this agreement, there would have been no agreement. So this is the trade officials being really honest about where these agreements come from. GATS is a very dangerous agreement. General Agreement on Trade and Services, generally known as GATS, is a really dangerous agreement. What it does is it basically sets up a framework for the commodification and commercialization of services. Now, services, as you know, are incredibly broad. They're often defined as anything you can't drop on your foot is a service. So it covers many of the things that we care about in this room. And the important thing about GATS is although it's an agreement that you opt into, so you make commitments into it, once you make those commitments, it's virtually irreversible. So you get locked in, and when you're locked into an agreement, you can't then deny access to multinationals who want to invest in that agreement. You may already have enough suppliers. You may want to exclude multinationals from a sector which is important to your own companies and to help small companies get a foothold. You can't exclude multinationals once you make these agreements, nor can you regulate without risking a challenge by the multinationals. So these agreements, once you put them into place, are very dangerous. Now, GATS is bad enough by itself. There is a new agreement which is now being called GATS on steroids, and it's called TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. And TISA, thankfully for the Philippines, doesn't include the Philippines. It includes many other countries that are represented in this room. And TISA would extend the GATS agreement into many more areas and would make it top-down. So it says, unless you opt out, everything's included, including new sectors that we don't know about yet. So TISA is a very dangerous agreement. The other way that we have trade agreements being negotiated is increasingly in these regional agreements. So the World Trade Organization has been put on hold, largely because the rich countries don't want to open up their agriculture and don't want to negotiate on agriculture, and so the WTO is on hold. So what did the rich countries do? Well, they now go round the WTO, and they're setting up these regional trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And in our country, I've been the coordinator of the anti-TPP agreement. Some of you may know that the United States pulled out, but Japan has gone into the driving seat, and Japan suddenly regards themselves as the champion of the TPP agreement. They are planning to sign it on the 8th of March in Chile. The fight is still going on, but we may not be able to stop that agreement between 11 countries. And the danger with TPP is that it includes new provisions that stop governments in regulating the economy. And they stop governments from being able to regulate in favour of public services. And why this is important for public services is because when governments want to give preferences for the public sector on the basis of public sector control and delivery of public services, they are prevented from doing so by the trade agreements that they sign. Now, the TPP takes that to a new level. But, and this is important for people in the room, so does a new agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, RCEP. And RCEP is under negotiation, primarily led by China, but involving all the ASEAN countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, other countries. And RCEP does the same thing. Basically, it's not quite as extreme as the TPP at the moment, because the US hasn't been part of it. But countries like Japan and Australia and New Zealand have been trying to take whole chunks of the TPP to put them into RCEP, particularly on issues like intellectual property. But again, RCEP will affect public services and will affect the rights of countries to be able to re-regulate their public services. So the fight against RCEP is being geared up. The negotiations are still continuing. Many of you may have been fighting in Manila last May when the negotiations were held in Manila, but that campaign is a vitally important campaign for us to win. Now, we're not going to win every one of these campaigns. All of them, we should be taking the energy from fighting these campaigns into a new campaign to exit the agreements that are signed. But we need to recall that we're not losing all of these battles by any means. Some of you may recall, in addition to the struggles we had against the structural adjustment programs, there was an agreement called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. We mobilized against the MAI and we won. We mobilized against the World Trade Organization in picking up those proposals and trying to put them into the WTO in Seattle, and the trade talks collapsed. And then in Cancun, 4 years later, the trade talks collapsed. We were effective in those struggles. In Europe, they were effective in particular in fighting the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and that agreement is now off the table. We have the ability to win these struggles. And it's important that we remember that we should feel empowered in doing so, because the global matters. And you know, the key message that I want to say is, when we're campaigning on water, on healthcare, on education, any other sector that we care about, whether it be at the municipal level, whether it be at the community level, whether it be at the national level, we have to link our struggles back to the global level, because if we don't, then we lose that important connection where global pressure is applied on our governments to sign up to these deals and then locked in